History's deadliest medical cures. Let's do a quick thought experiment. I want you to imagine waking up with a migraine, not just a normal headache, but one of those blinding, throbbing migraines where you can actually feel your heartbeat in your temples. Normally, you'd just pop a painkiller, drink a glass of water, and wait for it to blow over, but we are going to rewind the clock way back in time. I'm talking 10,000 years ago, right in the middle of the Stone Age. There are no pharmacies, there are no doctors in white coats, there is just you and your tribe and the absolute brutality of prehistoric survival. So what would you do in this situation? You just go to the smartest person in your tribe, the shaman, and you tell them that your head feels like it's going to explode. The shaman nods, tells you to sit down on a log, and instead of handing you medicine, he reaches for a sharp, jagged piece of obsidian. What happens next is a procedure called trepanation, and it's exactly as horrifying as it sounds. Fully awake with zero anesthesia, the shaman would take the sharp stone and begin physically scraping and drilling a massive hole into your skull. Now, you have to ask yourself why. Why would anyone willingly let someone carve a sunroof into their head? They weren't just torturing people for fun. You have to put yourself in the mind of an early human. To them, illness wasn't biological malfunction. Sickness was spiritual. If your head is pounding with severe unexplained pressure, their logic was actually completely straightforward. There is a demon or an evil spirit trapped inside your skull. And if there is a demon trapped inside a bone cage, you have to physically open a door to let it out. It is terrifying, but here is the absolute craziest part of this entire era. You would think that having a guy scrape a hole in your head with a dirty rock you just found on the ground is an instant death sentence, right? Between the direct brain trauma, the ungodly amount of blood loss, and the fact that they didn't even knew what bacteria was yet, it should have been 100% fatality rate, right? But archaeologists have dug up thousands of these trampled skulls all across Europe, America and Asia, and a massive percentage of them show smooth-healed bones around the edges of the hole. That means that a shocking number of people actually survived this. They went through an open skull surgery with a literal rock and survived, and just went back to the hunting and gathering with a permanent blowhole on the top of their head. In fact, the irony of human history is that you actually had a significantly higher chances of surviving this barbaric open-air tribal rock surgery than you did if you checked into a modern, overcrowded, completely unhygienic European hospital around 17th to 18th century, thousands of years later. Let's jump forward to the early modern era, right around 15th to 18th century. Let me ask you a logical question. If your car engine starts making a weird noise, you don't just open the valve and drain all the oil onto the driveway, right? Because the car needs oil to run, right? Well, apparently, early modern doctors didn't understand the concept when it comes to the human body, because their absolute favorite cure-all treatment for almost every disease was bloodletting. Now, bloodletting, which is intentionally draining blood from a patient's body, is actually an ancient practice dating back over 3,000 years. But during the early modern era, doctors completely lost their mind and became incredibly aggressive with it. They were literally sucking out more blood than Dracula. If you had a fever, a cough, or literally just felt a little tired, a doctor would walk in, look you up and down, and essentially say, "Sir, you might have some bad blood." They genuinely believed that your body was just full of toxic bad blood that needs to be aggressively flushed out. At first, they were just using a standard knife or a blade to cut open a vein, but doctors soon realized that individually slicing people open by hand was just taking way too much time. They need to optimize the blood draining process. So they invented a terrifying little gadget called the scarificator. Not gonna lie, this thing sounds like a movie villain. And it looked like a literal torture device. It was a small brace spring-loaded box hiding multiple razor-sharp blades inside. The doctors would press this little metal box against your skin, pull a trigger, and snap. Multiple blades would instantly pop out, slashing your skin all at once, so you would bleed out faster. And they advertised this as a cure for literally everything. You would think that this sounds like a scam meant for uneducated peasants, right? But no, this was the absolute peak of high-end medical science, and not even the most powerful men in the world were spared. Which brings us to the first president of United States, George Washington. In December of 1799, George Washington came down with a severe throat infection. He was even struggling to breathe. So his world-class team of doctors did what any highly trained medical professional of that era would do. They grabbed their blades and started draining his blood. They didn't just take a little bit. Over the course of a few hours, His doctor drained nearly half of the blood out of his entire body. Unsurprisingly, draining half the blood from an already sick elderly man didn't cure his throat infection. It sent his body into massive shock. George Washington passed away on December 14, 1799, not just because he was sick, but because his doctors essentially bled him dry trying to save him. It took years before scientists finally realized that taking the life fluid out of a dying person was a terrible idea, and the practice was finally stopped. Alright, let's jump into the medieval England somewhere between 12th and 15th century. Let me paint a picture for you. Imagine it's the Middle Ages and you need a surgery. Today, if you're going to have a surgery, an anesthesiologist will hook you up to an IV with computer-calculated microscopic precision to safely put you to sleep. But in medieval England, they just brewed a magical potion called the Well. The word Well literally translates to sleep. It was a crude, extremely potent herbal concoction designed to knock a patient out cold before the surgeons went to work. And honestly, the procedure itself sounds incredibly cozy. According to the medieval medical guides, the doctors would take this herbal concoction and mix it into a pot of good wine. You would literally just sit in a chair next to a nice warm fireplace, sipping your laced wine until you fell completely unconscious. Once you were out, the surgeons would take a mixture of salt and vinegar, rub it directly onto your skin, and then safely begin cutting you open, basically treating you like a giant potato chip. Sounds like pretty relaxing way to head into surgery, right? Well, here is a massive horrifying catch that made the Well incredibly dangerous. These potions were made from heavy hardcore plants, but the problem was medieval doctors were no scientists. They had absolutely zero way of determining the actual concentration of active alkaloids inside the plants that they were picking. This meant that the line between a beneficial dose that put you in a medical trance and a fatal dose that sent you to the graveyard was razor thin. If the plants they picked that day happens to be just a little bit more potent than usual, or if the doctors added a single extra drop to your wine, you wouldn't just fall asleep. You would go straight into a respiratory arrest and die right there in front of the fireplace. It was basically a game of surgical Russian roulette. But here is the absolute craziest part of this entire era. You would think that a potion with a razor thin margin of error for causing instant respiratory death would be heavily regulated, right? Or at least restricted to only the best doctors, right? Nope. Despite knowing the lethal risk, the Well was a common knowledge all across England. It was so popular that ordinary housewives would casually brew this highly lethal surgical anesthetic right at home in their kitchens to care for their sick family members. Just a medieval mom making a pot of lethal knockout wine right next to the evening stew. Now you would think that as we moved into the early 20th century, medicines would finally get a lot safer, right? Science was advancing, we were making huge breakthroughs, we had just discovered radiation, and what was humanity's first instinct when we found a highly radioactive element? We decided to bottle it up and drink it. Here comes Radiator. This was a notorious radioactive patent medicine sold in the early 1900s. It was falsely marketed as the ultimate cure for all. The creators boldly claimed that drinking this radioactive water could cure over 150 different conditions, from high blood pressure to chronic fatigue or all the way to sexual impotence. If you think about it, it was basically the Red Bull of that time. To show you just how crazy this got, let's look at a guy named Eben Bias. Bias was a wealthy American industrialist and a champion golfer. After he suffered a minor arm injury, his doctor actually suggested he try drinking Radiator to help it heal. Bias absolutely loved it. He claimed it gave him so much energy that he started drinking multiple bottles every single day. Over the course of several years, he consumed roughly 1400 bottles of literal radioactive water. Now we know today that radium provides absolutely zero health benefits and only cause severe harm. Even small doses of radium are incredibly dangerous. They don't take you out immediately, instead they act as slow burn ticking time bomb inside your body. But 1400 bottles? Well, by 1931 his body had finally had enough. The massive amount of radiation had completely destroyed his skeleton structure from inside out, and his jaw literally dropped. The very next year in 1932, Bias died an incredibly gruesome death from radiation-induced cancer and bone necrosis. It was quite literally a jaw-dropping moment for the medical community and a horrifying reminder that just because something glows doesn't mean you should chug it. If you enjoyed watching humanity make terrible medical disasters, do me a huge favor and press that like button. Subscribe and share this with a friend who complains about taking modern medicines. Peace out.